Well, next up is our Chris Farrell. Chris is, as I said, has started all these investigations at Judicial Watch with his colleagues there, and is probably, other than one of the few folks in the country who's read all the Clinton emails that have been released, and knows what others are about to be released, and can give us a great update and certainly some unique insight on the classification issues that have been we've been so misled about, thanks to John Kerry's State Department, the Obama administration, and Mr. Comey.
Thank you, Tom, and it's great to be with this panel. What a great opportunity for the American public to get up to speed on what the real story is, and not necessarily the talking points from the Clinton campaign or from the Justice Department. You know, I come at this investigation, at this whole problem of Clinton corruption, from the perspective of an intelligence officer. I was commissioned as an Army intelligence officer, became a special agent of Army counterintelligence, and then later on was trained as a clandestine human intelligence case officer. So my view on these things is both from a defensive standpoint, from counterintelligence perspective, having conducted counterespionage investigations, but also from the point of view of an intelligence officer looking to collect against a target. And so when you look at the track record, at the pattern of behavior, of the conduct, of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed through this entire scandal, you know, the American public is being misled, and they're being misled in a very deliberate fashion, which is not just disturbing from a factual basis, but it's deeply corrosive to the public's understanding of what's been put at risk by Mrs. Clinton and her conduct. So as a special agent of Army counterintelligence, I'm directly personally responsible for neutralizing, for stopping 6 Foreign Intelligence Service agents. Those are cases that I ran. I've put people in jail, not just under the American legal system, but even under the German legal system. I've worked with the Attorney General in Baden-Württemberg to put a guy in jail for spying, for espionage. And in particular, I think everyone needs to appreciate that Mrs. Clinton was the subject of a national security crime investigation. This wasn't a security review. It wasn't an argument over classification levels. This was a violation of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 793F, mishandling national defense information. And contrary to what the American public has been told repeatedly, intent is not an element of the crime. There's no requirement to prove any sort of intent at all. And so when Mr. Comey talks about intent, or he wasn't able to prove it, or there was no sort of specification that showed an intent, it's a red herring. It's a false argument. It isn't a requirement of the crime. So we know from the Inspector General of the intelligence community that 22 top secret SCI, which is sensitive compartmented information, it's a special category of intelligence collection, 22 top secret SCI messages or emails went across Mrs. Clinton's unsecured server. It's a fact. It's a finding of the Inspector General. That's the root of the referral to the Department of Justice that caused them to begin this inquiry. The fact that that has occurred puts the United States at grave risk. That's the definition, really, for compromising top secret material. That is the issue that is really the focal point of what the FBI should have been looking at. And it's a yes or no question. It's not what did you intend. It's not how did you feel about it. It's not what were you really trying to accomplish. It's a yes or no question. Did this event occur? Yes or no? And then if it did occur, who is responsible for it? What is the proximate cause of this event occurring? And if you walk it back to find the person who made it happen, that's who's prosecuted. And this whole intent thing is nonsense. Mr. Comey is lying to the American public when he goes down that path. The reason I say that is because there's lots of people sitting in jail for doing just that. It's not speculative. It's not an interpretation. You know, our colleague Joe's, I'm sure, will talk about the idea that Mr. Comey is calling the shots on prosecutions, which last time I checked was an issue for the Attorney General or a U.S. attorney, not the FBI director. But nonetheless, this information passed. We know it passed. And anybody would be looking for that kind of information on the server. Not just the Russians and the Chinese, but frankly, you know, any kind of first world intelligence service, whether it's the Germans, the Israelis, the Japanese, any first-class intelligence operation would be looking for that kind of material on an unsecured server. Not only would they look for classified information like that, they'd even look for unclassified information. So when she tries to talk it away and say, oh, well, you know, it's no big deal because these were my daughter's wedding plans and her yoga routines, which is a terrifying thought in and of itself. But if that was what was on her server unclassified, look, a foreign intelligence service wants to know that information. They want to know what is occupying time and space in her head. What is she focused on? Who is she talking to? About what? When? That's all part of the mosaic. It's all pieces of the puzzle that a foreign intelligence service looks at, trying to put together what is the Secretary of State of the United States doing? What's important? What isn't important? So that's just another kind of component of this larger question. Look, on this investigation itself, there's a methodology that any counterintelligence professional goes through when it comes to collecting evidence, interviewing people who are either witnesses or subjects. Anybody who has access to sensitive compartmental information is subject to a polygraph. Have you ever heard anybody discuss Mrs. Clinton being polygraphed? Not a whisper, not a word. And I can assure you that there are hundreds of thousands of persons in this country with security clearances, whether it's law enforcement, the intelligence services, the armed forces, who are all routinely subject to polygraph exams. I myself have been polygraphed several times. And because I had access not just to SCI material, but also to something Mrs. Clinton was familiar with, and that's a SAP, a Special Access Program. And so that wasn't even brought up as a question or an issue. Why wasn't she questioned about being polygraphed? It's a requirement. I think the most telling thing with respect to Mrs. Clinton in this national security crime investigation is that this sort of brokered voluntary interview that seems to have been orchestrated by David Kendall was not a rights warning environment. It wasn't a rights warning event. That was my first question when I learned that she was being questioned that Saturday morning. Because if I'm a federal law enforcement officer and I have reason to believe you've committed a crime and I'm questioning you concerning that, I'm obligated to give you a Miranda warning. I have to give you a rights warning. It's not negotiable. And so if I'm not Mirandizing you, if I'm not giving you a rights warning, and I'm a law enforcement officer who's capable of apprehending you for a violation of the law, and I don't do a rights warning, don't take it too terribly serious, even if you do bring 9 attorneys to the interview with you. That's a very telling moment that it wasn't a rights warning. The larger scale thing, I think also, sort of the unintended consequence of all this, my last point I'll wrap on, is that the FBI director, Mr. Comey, is personally compromised. He's complicit in this scandal. And there's a larger, besides that very unfortunate, very sad circumstance, the larger thing is the institutional damage done to the FBI. This is not something that the institution will get over. They've been shamed by this. It's corrosive to the public's trust in the justice system and to law enforcement generally. There are unintended consequences to this entire affair beyond Mrs. Clinton's reckless treatment of classified information and her absconding with federal records. There are long-term impacts, and we can talk more about it, obviously, but I think the public really needs to appreciate the grave danger that she's placed the United States in.
Before I bring Jerry in, Chris, that was an excellent presentation. Could you talk about retroactive classification, that new made-up term that we've been lied to about?
Sure. There's this attempt to sort of unring the bell, right? An attempt to say that something that happened in the past really wasn't as bad as you think it is. It's a deliberate obfuscation of the record. The Inspector General went ahead and analyzed this case, of course, the Inspector General for the intelligence community, and found these 22 top secret SCI messages that went across. In hindsight, there's supposed to be a damage assessment that's done whenever there's a compromise of national security information. Shockingly, the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, has refused to do a damage assessment. It's a statutory requirement. The law requires it to be done. He's saying that he's not going to do it. Frankly, we should sue him over that, frankly. But this notion that...
I'll take note.
Yeah, please do. It's a good thing for us to do.
Anyone know a good lawyer?
The instance here, though, is that what they're doing is, in doing a damage assessment, they're pointing out that stuff that was treated as unclassified at the time was, in fact, classified. It's part of a damage assessment. It's nothing new. It certainly does not exonerate Mrs. Clinton in any way. In fact, it compounds the problem. Again, it's another red herring. It's a false choice argument that's being offered up by her surrogates to say, oh, it's not as bad as you think it is. Kind of like the whole Colin Powell thing. It's a phony argument. It's an attempt to muddy the waters. The facts on the ground are bad enough, and any other federal government employee doing the exact same thing, you would see B-roll of FBI agents dragging cardboard boxes out of their houses. That's the way it works for any other United States citizen.
Yeah, I see in the FBI interview notes that Mrs. Clinton thought it was okay to discuss a pending drone strike as long as it didn't actually happen. So she talked about a planned drone strike, but as long as the drone attack never happened, it's okay despite it being highly classified itself. It's just
mind-boggling.
It's really disturbing.